On a humid July afternoon in 1998, the forest looked harmless. The kind of place where cicadas droned lazily in the heat, where sunlight filtered through pine needles in soft, trembling beams, and where two boys in Boy Scout uniforms could disappear without anyone noticing, at least not right away. The brothers were Ethan Harper, 13, and Lucas Harper, 11. They were inseparable in the way only siblings close in age can be. Ethan was taller, quieter, already carrying the weight of responsibility like a second backpack. Lucas was smaller, curious, always asking questions, always trailing a step behind his older brother, trusting him completely. That afternoon, they had attended a local Boy Scout activity on the edge of the forested hills outside their small town. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would later feel ominous. Other scouts remembered them laughing, adjusting their sashes, arguing about who had earned more badges. By late afternoon, witnesses would later say, the boys were seen walking back toward the forest, away from the dirt access road, their uniforms unmistakable against the green wall of trees. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. At first, no one panicked. The Harpers lived in a place where children roamed freely. The woods were familiar. The boys had camped there before. When dinner came and went, their parents assumed the brothers had stopped at a friend's house or lingered longer than planned. But by nightfall, the sky changed. Dark clouds rolled in fast, swallowing the fading orange light. Wind snapped branches overhead. Rain followed, hard, relentless, pounding the forest floor until paths disappeared beneath mud and runoff. By the time the storm hit full force, the boys were already gone. The call went out just after midnight. Local deputies arrived first, then volunteer firefighters, then search and rescue teams. Flashlights cut frantic arcs through the rain-soaked undergrowth. Dogs were brought in at dawn, their handlers struggling to maintain scent trails washed thin by the storm. For days, the forest echoed with shouts of the boys' names. Ethan, Lucas. Helicopters skimmed the treetops. Creeks were checked for signs of flooding. Fallen trees were lifted. Abandoned clearings were searched inch by inch. And everywhere they looked, the same assumption settled in. The storm had taken them. Search leaders told the family it was the most likely explanation. Two young boys. Dense woods. Sudden severe weather. Exposure. Disorientation. Nature didn't need a motive. But for the Harpers, that explanation never sat right. Because there were things that didn't make sense. The boys were trained scouts. They knew basic survival. They knew to seek shelter, to stay put, to make themselves visible. And yet, no campsite. No broken branches indicating a fall. No scraps of fabric snagged on thorns. Nothing. Just forest. After 3 weeks, the official search was scaled back. After 6, it was formally closed. The conclusion was written quietly into the record. Presumed deceased due to exposure. The storm became the story people told themselves because it was easier than imagining something else. Something intentional. Time moved on, as it always does. The forest reclaimed the paths cut by search teams. Posters faded and peeled. The Harpers moved away, unable to stay in a town that felt like a graveyard with no headstones. The case became a footnote. Local lore, whispered around campfires. A cautionary tale told to new scouts about respecting the weather, respecting the woods. But not everyone forgot. Some of the original volunteers would later admit that the case lingered with them, that it bothered them in quiet moments, that they replayed the map in their heads, wondering how two boys could vanish so completely. No bones, no backpacks, no badges. It was as if Ethan and Lucas had stepped into the trees and been erased. And then, in the summer of 2008, the forest spoke again. It happened on a logging site several miles deeper into the woods, far beyond the area that had been thoroughly searched back in 1998. A private logging crew had been contracted to clear an overgrown section of land recently sold to a development company. Heavy machinery chewed through brush that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Late one afternoon, a machine operator felt a sudden violent jolt. Metal screamed against metal. The blade had struck something solid, something hollow. At first, they assumed it was an old septic tank or discarded industrial debris. But when the dirt was pulled away, what emerged didn't belong in the forest at all. A rusted shipping container. Buried deliberately. Covered with soil, roots, and fallen trees. Hidden in a way that suggested intention, not accident. The crew shut down operations immediately. When the container was finally opened by authorities, the air inside was stale, sealed off from the world for a decade. And at first glance, it appeared empty. No bodies. No remains. Just dirt. Rock. And silence. Then a forensic technician noticed something wedged beneath the container itself, caught between compacted earth and corroded steel. Fabric. Green. Roughly torn. When it was carefully pulled free, the room went quiet. It was a Boy Scout uniform. Weathered. Partially decayed. The insignia barely visible, but unmistakable. The storm theory collapsed in an instant. Because uniforms don't end up beneath buried containers. And forests don't hide shipping containers on their own. Within hours, phone calls were made to retired officers. Old files were pulled from storage. Names that hadn't been spoken in years resurfaced. Ethan Harper. Lucas Harper. 10 years after they vanished, the case was officially reopened. But the uniform raised more questions than it answered. Why was only one uniform found? Where was the other brother? Why was the container buried miles from the original search area? And perhaps most chilling of all, if someone went to the trouble of hiding a container in the forest, what exactly were they trying to hide? As investigators prepared to dig deeper, unaware of what they were about to uncover, one thing became painfully clear. The storm had never been the real danger. And whatever took those boys into the woods had waited a long time to be found. When the case was reopened in 2008, the forest no longer felt like a place of tragic accident. It felt staged. Investigators who had not worked the original disappearance walked the old terrain with fresh eyes. They weren't looking for lost boys anymore. They were looking for human intent, patterns, decisions, mistakes. And almost immediately, they began to see things the storm theory had buried. The first step was to reconstruct the boys' final known movements. In 1998, witnesses had placed Ethan and Lucas Harper on the dirt access road just before the tree line. They were walking toward the forest, not away from it. That detail had always been known, but now it took on new weight. If they were heading into the woods voluntarily, where were they going? Old Boy Scout records were pulled. Meeting notes. Activity plans. Route maps from past outings. The brothers had not been scheduled to camp that day. They had no gear beyond what they wore. No sleeping bags. No food packs. No flashlights. Which raised a troubling possibility. Someone may have told them to go into the forest. Meteorological records were re-examined. Yes, a storm had occurred that night, but it hadn't hit until hours after the boys were last seen. In other words, Ethan and Lucas entered the forest before conditions became dangerous. That meant there was a window, possibly several hours, during which something else could have happened. Something deliberate. Search logs from 1998 were reviewed line by line. And that's when investigators found the first major oversight. Search and rescue dog reports noted something unusual at the time, but it had been dismissed. Multiple dogs picked up the boy's scent near the tree line, and then lost it abruptly. Not gradually. Not scattered. It stopped. At the time, handlers assumed the storm had washed the scent away. That explanation was accepted without much debate. But now, paired with a buried container, it suggested something far more unsettling. An abrupt end to a scent trail often indicates transport. As in, the boys didn't keep walking. They were taken somewhere else. The uniform itself became the centerpiece of the reopened investigation. Forensic testing confirmed what many had already suspected. The uniform belonged to Lucas, the younger brother. Size markings matched. The stitching pattern matched uniforms issued that year. Faded initials, LH, were still barely visible inside the collar. But the damage told a story of its own. The fabric wasn't torn by animals. The edges were ragged but linear, consistent with forceful removal. And there was dirt pressed deep into the fibers, suggesting it had been trapped beneath something heavy for a long time. Like a shipping container. Which raised a disturbing question. Why remove only one boy's uniform? Attention shifted to the container itself. Shipping containers aren't subtle. Moving one into dense forest requires equipment, planning, and access. Burying it requires even more effort. This wasn't a crime of impulse. Whoever did this knew the terrain, how to avoid detection, how to hide something for years. Investigators began compiling a list of individuals with deep familiarity with the area. Loggers, hunters, land surveyors, contractors, and one group stood out almost immediately. In the original 1998 search, dozens of volunteers had assisted. Most were local. Some were transient workers. One name resurfaced repeatedly in the logs. A man who had shown up early every day. A man who knew the back trails better than most. A man who volunteered to search alone. At the time, he had seemed helpful. Dedicated. Now, investigators wondered why his name appeared in so many different search zones. Zones that, in retrospect, had not been thoroughly examined. Records showed he had suggested multiple areas were already cleared, discouraging further searches there. One of those areas was less than 2 miles from where the container was eventually found. Investigators also re-interviewed townspeople who had been dismissed years earlier. A former scout remembered something that had seemed insignificant at the time. On the day of the disappearance, Ethan had mentioned to another boy that they were meeting someone. At the time, everyone assumed it meant another scout. But no meeting had been scheduled. And no other scout ever came forward. Lucas, according to a neighbor, had been unusually quiet that afternoon. Nervous. Excited. As if he knew something big was about to happen, but didn't fully understand what it was. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. The case had been closed because it was easy to close. A storm provided an answer without a suspect. Nature couldn't be arrested. Nature didn't require paperwork or confrontation. But now, faced with evidence that suggested human involvement, the case reopened wounds long thought sealed. And one question loomed larger than all the others. If the boys didn't die in the storm, what happened to them inside that container? Because while the uniform had been found beneath it, nothing had been found inside it. Not yet. By the time investigators reached out to the man whose name kept resurfacing in the old search logs, they already knew one thing for certain. If someone had moved, buried, and concealed a shipping container deep in that forest, it had been done by a person who didn't just enter the woods. They belonged there. His name was Caleb Moore. In 1998, Moore had been in his mid-40s, working seasonal jobs that kept him moving between logging crews, land clearing contracts, and forestry maintenance. He had no permanent address at the time, something that hadn't raised concern back then, but now felt uncomfortably convenient. Moore had not been officially affiliated with the Boy Scouts. He had simply shown up when news broke that 2 boys were missing. According to old statements, he claimed he was good with woods and wanted to help. And help he did, perhaps too much. He searched longer hours than anyone else. He volunteered for the most remote sections. He insisted on checking areas that were difficult to access and, later, insisted they were clear. Search coordinators had welcomed the extra manpower. Now, they wondered if they'd let the wrong man walk freely through a crime scene. When investigators finally located Moore in 2008, he was living several counties away, working maintenance at a storage facility. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The interview began calmly. Moore remembered the case clearly. Too clearly. He recalled the weather, the terrain, the boys' names. And when asked about the area where the container was found, he paused. Just long enough. He said he'd passed through there once or twice during the original search, but insisted nothing had been there at the time. That statement was technically true, because back then, the container was already buried. Investigators confronted Moore with a reconstructed timeline from 1998. On the second day of the search, Moore had signed out a vehicle late in the afternoon, alone. He returned nearly 6 hours later, long after dark. At the time, it was assumed he'd been searching. No one asked for details. No one tracked his route. Those 6 hours were never accounted for. Now, paired with the location of the container, those hours became impossible to ignore. With probable cause building, authorities obtained permission to re-examine the container site more thoroughly. This time, they didn't stop at what was visible. They excavated deeper. Beneath the container, under layers of compacted soil, they found more fabric. Another piece of uniform. This one smaller. Belonging to Ethan. Unlike Lucas's, it wasn't torn, it had been folded. Deliberately placed. And beneath it, a disturbing absence. No remains. No bones. Nothing to suggest the boys had died there. Which meant the container wasn't a grave. It was a holding place. Behavioral analysts were brought in. Their conclusion was chilling. The uniforms weren't left behind by accident. They were discarded. Removed to strip the boys of identity. To separate them from the image people would remember. The fact that one uniform was damaged while the other was folded suggested different moments, different emotional states. Panic. Then control. And then concealment. Using modern mapping tools, investigators traced a plausible route from where the boys were last seen to the container site. It wasn't direct. It followed lesser-known game trails, paths someone experienced would know, paths a volunteer searcher like Moore had walked countless times. And near the midpoint of that route, something else was found. A rusted metal stake driven into the ground, with remnants of old rope fibers still clinging to it. When Moore was confronted with the new findings, his demeanor shifted. He didn't deny knowing the trails anymore. He didn't deny being near the area. Instead, he claimed the boys must have been curious and wandered off with someone else. But when asked why the container was buried so carefully, he had no answer. And when investigators asked the final question, why did the dogs lose the scent so abruptly? More stood up and asked for a lawyer. Despite everything, there was still a devastating problem. No remains. No cause of death. No definitive proof of what happened after the boys entered the container. Without bodies, prosecutors were hesitant. Moore was released, watched, but never charged. The case stalled again, this time under the weight of what investigators suspected, but couldn't yet prove. And then, years later, a final discovery would surface, one that answered the most haunting question of all. Why were there no bodies left behind? 4 years after the container was uncovered, the case existed in a painful in-between state. Everyone involved, investigators, prosecutors, the remaining Harper family, believed the same thing. Someone had taken Ethan and Lucas. Someone had hidden them. And someone had made sure the forest would never give them back. But belief was not enough. What finally pushed the case forward didn't come from the woods. It came from paper. In 2016, nearly 18 years after the boys vanished, a cold case analyst reviewing land ownership near the container site noticed something odd. The parcel where the shipping container had been buried had changed hands twice between 1997 and 1999. The first transfer happened just 4 months before the disappearance. The second happened 6 months after the search officially ended. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the reason listed for the first transfer: temporary storage and land staging. That phrasing didn't appear on other nearby parcels. Only this one. Digging deeper, the analyst requested archived transport permits tied to the land staging request. Most had been destroyed after 10 years. One hadn't. It listed the temporary placement of a single decommissioned shipping container, delivered in early June 1998. Weeks before the boys vanished. The delivery company no longer existed. The driver was listed only by last name. And the individual who signed for the container was not the landowner. It was a contractor. A seasonal forestry worker. Someone who had reason to be in the woods. Someone whose name was already in the case file. Investigators now understood something they hadn't before. The container wasn't buried after the disappearance. It had been buried in anticipation of something. Vent holes, small, carefully drilled, were found during a second forensic sweep. Hidden beneath corrosion. Positioned in a way that suggested airflow, not drainage. This wasn't a coffin. It was a temporary enclosure. And that explained the most disturbing question of all. Why there were no bodies. Not long after the shipping manifest was uncovered, the cold case unit received a call. No name. No return number. Just a voice, older, strained, deliberate. The caller said they had worked briefly with a man in the late 1990s who used to brag about knowing places where no one would ever look. He talked about kids. Not directly. Always vaguely. The caller remembered one specific comment. Storms are useful. People stop asking questions. The man had also talked about moving cargo through back routes, transferring it to others who handle things long-term. When investigators asked for a name, the line went dead. But they didn't need one. They already had it. Behavioral analysts revisited the decision to leave the Boy Scout uniforms behind. They concluded it served 2 purposes. First, practical. Uniforms were recognizable. If the boys were moved elsewhere, those clothes couldn't go with them. Second, psychological. Leaving the uniform under the container anchored the narrative to the forest. It ensured that if the truth ever surfaced, it would still point back to nature, to tragedy, to accident. The storm had been chosen as the story. The uniforms were the punctuation mark. Caleb Moore was questioned one final time. He denied everything. He admitted nothing. And once again, prosecutors hit the same wall. Without remains, without witnesses willing to testify, without proof of what happened after the boys entered the container, there was no charge that would stick. Moore died quietly in the early 2020s. The case died with him, at least officially. The current consensus is grim. Ethan and Lucas were lured into the forest by someone they didn't fear. They were taken to a location already prepared in advance. They were held temporarily, and then, at some point, they were moved. Where? No one knows. Investigators suspect they were transported out of the area within days, possibly hours, using routes that were never searched because no one believed to look beyond the storm. The forest wasn't where they died. It was where they disappeared. Today, the container site is marked only by disturbed earth and a small, unofficial memorial placed by locals. No names. Just 2 scout badges nailed to a tree. The case remains open. No suspect has ever been formally charged. No remains have ever been found. And the most unsettling truth of all is this. For 10 years, the forest held a secret in plain sight. And even when it finally gave up the uniform, it never gave back the boys. Because whatever happened to Ethan and Lucas Harper wasn't an accident. It was planned. And somewhere beyond the tree line, the rest of the truth may still be waiting, buried not in the ground, but in someone's memory.